Welcome to the Mindflick Podcast. The Mindflick Podcast explores the psychology of high performance, focusing on the mindset shifts, leadership decisions, and personal turning points that shape how people think, lead, and grow. I'm Sir Andrew Strauss, Chairman of Mindflick.
And I'm Pete Lindsay, performance psychologist and co-founder at Mindflick. And we'll be taking you inside the mindset shifts that have shaped some of the best minds in both sport and business. And we'll blend that thought leadership with real life stories, bringing performance psychology to life in a way that's practical, human, and impactful.
Every episode, we will sit down with leaders, athletes, and change makers to uncover the turning points, the pressure moments, and the crucial experiences that define their journey. Well, on today's show, we had the great pleasure of welcoming Gilad Tiefenbrun, the CEO of Linn Products, to talk to us on the Mindflick podcast. Pete, and really interesting story that he had to tell.
Yeah, it's fascinating to get the inside perspective on his journey through Nokia, times when maybe they fumbled the opportunity with touchscreen technology, but the lessons he learned there and to bring those into his father's company, to allow that company to kind of recover and kind of be reborn in many ways. It's a deeply kind of personal journey, professional journey, and in many ways, there's a degree of a hero's journey that we kind of run through, from personal challenges to going into the unknown and to coming out the other side.
We hope you enjoy the episode. Gilad, a very warm welcome to the Mindflick podcast. I'm very excited about interviewing you today. We often talk about trying to be the best in the world at what we do, and so excited to hear about you and what you do, because I think for a lot of people, they would see the company that you run as being the very best in the world at what it does, and very keen to get into that and explain and understand how you operate. But to start off, Gilad, what are you best known for and what are you doing now?
I'm best known for being the CEO of Linn Products. That is what I'm doing now. And I've been at Linn for 22 years, continually making the best audio products in the world, the best hi-fi for people's homes. And we just try and get better at what we do every year.
I suppose if you're not an audiophile, a lot of people might not have actually heard of Linn Products at all. But Mark Borden, our CEO, is an audiophile, and he constantly talks about how amazing Linn is. And we were very lucky to go up to your factory and see how the products are made and designed, etc. I mean, what does tend to sort of set Linn apart as an organization in your mind?
Very long-term thinking. So my dad started the business in 1973. With a turntable that he designed from first principles. And his key insight was to get more information out of the groove of the record. But with the knowledge that the technology of the day would improve, that meant that he designed his turntable to be modular and upgradable. And that's really what's given the company so much longevity. So it did two things. One, it attracted engineers who could work in parallel on improving aspects of the turntable. And the other thing it did was it meant that any customer who bought one of the Linn Sondek LP12 turntables anytime from 1973 onwards can have it fully upgraded to 2025 specification. So that sets us apart, is that longevity, long-term thinking, doing things in the customer's interests rather than short-term revenue generation, and a whole host of other parts of the Linn philosophy that all come from the way my dad set up the business and his vision for it in the first place. It was also a time when the dominant players in audio business were Japanese, so companies like Sony. And so one of the first places he went was Japan, because he felt like, well, if you want to be taken seriously as a hi-fi company, then you need to convince the Japanese. And Japan's one of our biggest markets in the world today as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. Obviously very keen to sort of get into that story in a bit more detail as we go through your turning points. But as our listeners will well know by now, our approach at the Mindflick Podcast is to really try and segment people's lives by these turning points, these moments, these sort of sliding doors moments where maybe you saw the world one way and then you had this experience and you saw the world very differently. And so we have teed you up, Gilad, haven't we? We've forced you to think a little bit about this.
And I loved it. I love being forced to think about it because I've never thought about it before. So I think it's a great way to approach the whole topic.
Awesome. Well, we always take positive feedback very favorably. So thanks for that. But why don't you start with your first turning point then?
So I was a young engineer working in London. My dad had always said to the three of us kids, we weren't to work in Linn and we were to go off and do our own things. So I'd worked in a couple of different tech companies in London and found myself at a company called Symbian, which came out of the old Scion software. Do you remember the Scion organizers?
Yeah.
It's a great British company, Scion, and they spun off this software company that then was to produce the first smartphone operating system. So it was totally revolutionary. Technology was moving really fast. 3G networks were coming. We were getting ready for the prospect of having like the internet on your phone, basically. Things that we take for granted today. But back then, we were really pioneers at Symbian in what was to become an operating system to go into Nokia, Ericsson, Motorola phones. At some point, I was tasked with running a project to produce a new version of the operating system that could handle high-speed graphics, touch-screen interfaces, and platform security. So it was the beginnings of what was going to be a big, big leap forward in technology for the company. And it took, I don't know, a year or a year and a half. It's a big, big project. But somewhere near the end, the lead customer, who was Nokia, decided that they didn't need it. They'd done their market research. Their graphic designers and everyone else had decided that customers didn't want touchscreens and they wanted their mobile phones just to keep working the way they always did. That was a turning point because I remember speaking to my dad at the time saying, I can't believe it, they've binned this project. Now, if you think just at Symbian, there were hundreds of engineers that worked on that over that period of time. How many years of work were being thrown in the bin? It was insane. The whole Jetstream team had put their heart and soul into it. At that point, my dad said to me, oh, well, maybe it's time for you to think about leaving that business. Doesn't sound like it's going in a great direction. And then, of course, we know what happened subsequently to that. You know, Nokia went from 40% plus market share to just out of mobile phones altogether. So this idea that you can dictate to customers when they're ready for something, you know, when the technology's there, is very, very risky. Not a clever thing to do at all.
Yeah, so in a way that technology was the right technology, but their sense was that the customers just weren't ready for it. Your sense was maybe they were.
I watched that film on BlackBerry, and BlackBerry went through their own version of that, didn't they? Where they reacted too slowly, they were held on too closely to the physical keyboard and all that sort of stuff, and then they had to go and start building it in China, and the quality went down and whatever. So, I mean, I suppose if you're being fair to Nokia, it was a very fast-moving time of which there were probably a lot of emerging technologies coming out, and you had to place all your bets on one thing or another. But to you, was it obvious that they were just missing the obvious trick here?
The principle, I would say, is that if you're the market leader, you cannot just rest on your laurels and think that you get to decide. You have to keep innovating. You have to keep pushing. You know yourself, Andrew, it's not a case that when you're the best, you just get to go, well, okay, that's good enough. And that's what I thought Nokia were doing.
Let's just go back to the good bit about this story, because I think you mentioned you had a very strong, good manager who allowed that team to function really well. I mean, what were your takeaways from that bit?
So there were at least 40 different technology teams. And so those technologies would be things like the bit that works with the phone network, the bit that makes Bluetooth work, the bit that makes Wi-Fi work. So lots of teams, lots of complexity in bringing all that software together. If you think about traditional software projects and where they go wrong, is if you leave everything to the end and everyone says, well, I've done my bit, and then you try and bring all those bits of technology together, there's going to be all kinds of interoperability problems and stuff to iron out that will take at least as long as the original development. What I was doing was I was bringing the software together as early as possible and introduced sometimes every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks integration deadlines where you'd make it all work with what you had, and it forced people to plan their projects differently and go, right, what can we showcase that will work in 1 month's time and in 2 months' time and in 3 months' time? And so we had this ethos which we developed of it kind of always working, even if it was very partially featured. So the biggest sin would be to break the overall software. So you kept it working, you kept the teams in lockstep, and you kept integrating the software as you went along. That meant that you're not going to get some nasty surprise at the end of the project. Everybody could work together much better, friction's taken out of the project, predictability's baked in. From when I joined Symbian, they could get the operating system together once a year or maybe less, to a place where we said, no, we're going to be ready to ship every 2 weeks. So that was really the really valuable bit.
The picture I get in my mind is like a conductor with an orchestra. You've got all the different parts, but of course, to practice, we're practicing together. And I remember we did a piece of work with a pit crew, Formula One pit crew. We had someone come in to talk about how orchestras practice, and they might practice at, a half pace, half speed, but we're all practicing at the same time. And it just made me think of that idea then, that it doesn't matter, this thing is going to work, the whole thing's going to work throughout this process. It's going to get faster, but it's going to keep working.
Yes. That's a good analogy, yeah.
It is a very good analogy, because my question was around siloed thinking, which is very dull and corporate, Pete, and I think you knocked it out of the park with that question, so well done there.
I mean, the classic thing in projects is when you're 90% complete, you've got another 90% to go, right? And that is the reason that happens is because you haven't had this kind of constant integration. It's because people are just working in their groups and our technology works, so we're good. And then there's still would be traditionally just masses of problems that would come later. So that was what we were trying to solve and what we did solve.
Well, I'm going to try my own analogy here, because you imagine in sports, sort of knowing what you have to work on to improve your game and going away and spending months working on that, hitting the ball brilliantly in the net, knowing that you're a better player than you were 3 or 4 months ago, and then going out in the middle and just getting a great delivery, or your teammates let you down or whatever. I mean, you have to contend with that in sport a lot. And I suppose you end up being a little bit philosophical in the sense that, I'm doing all I can. I'm only in control of what I'm in control of, and there are outside variables that I can't control. And I suppose that's a similar set of circumstances to what you went through then.
Yeah, because that also was quite shaping for me. Was I'd had some really bad managers who really micromanaging and didn't let you get on with things. But what was great about that Jetstream project is everybody had a clear role. I mean, there's going to be no surprises here, but everyone's role was clear. Everybody was given trust and responsibility to do what they needed to do. Your role as a manager is to support the team, not to be the hoarder of information or be the one that gets to decide everything. And I saw a style of management working on that project that I really respected, and one that I've adopted, or at least tried to adopt myself.
Really, so I suppose the turning point being, first of all, understanding what good looks like in terms of teams running effectively and how to get people to produce quality output. And then I suppose that second bit around that sort of arrogance of assuming you know better than everyone else.
Yes, it is, for sure.
Great. Well, I think that, so we leave that with your dad having the conversation with you about, well, maybe it's time to leave. I sense that your second turning point is going to be a little bit more sort of Linn focused.
Yes, because then I did join Linn in 2003, and I got my first serious management role heading up the R&D team at Linn. A move from London out to Glasgow seemed quite attractive, for lifestyle reasons. So we took the job up here, but not fully aware of the maelstrom I was entering at that time. For one thing, my dad was unwell with inflammatory bowel disease, and he hadn't really told a lot of people about it, so he wasn't as hands-on with the business as he might have been. They'd also sort of divisionalized the company and made it quite complicated and grown the headcount hugely, and we're going into all kinds of different areas. So really diversifying at that time. And with hindsight, it's clear that something had been lost in terms of the culture and values of the company through this big expansion. But for me, I walked in to an R&D department with 50 engineers who were really unhappy. I remember being told that the previous Christmas had been cancelled in order to hit some product deadlines. That's a red flag. Engineers were just being given deadlines and being told to hit these deadlines. And there was a lot of pressure on the company. It had grown its cost base. It had big sales numbers to hit, and it had some serious product reliability issues as a result of that.
I mean, it's interesting just thinking about you coming into that environment. Firstly, I suppose, having had a very different experience at Symbian, but also it's the family business, right? And so there must be a lot of sort of personal pride at stake, and I suppose a lot of pressure as well if you're coming into that sort of environment.
From my point of view, I'd been in and around the company since I was a little kid, so it felt like coming home, and I never felt that pressure of being the founder's son. For me, it was the opportunity to be what we couldn't do at Symbian, which is get the product all the way to the end customer. So at Symbian, you had Nokia kind of deciding, no, we don't want this. Whereas at Linn, you've got the design team, you've got the manufacturing team, you've got the sales team. You can design and make a product and get it out to customers and gauge a customer reaction and close the loop. And that is what is so exciting about working at Linn and in the product environment rather than in a pure software environment where you don't have that customer connection.
And Gilad, coming into that, so you've come from one environment, back into Linn, but you've not come in it's a bed of roses. You've come in this kind of challenges that you're facing within that R&D team. Like, what did you learn around what motivates or what alienates those kind of people?
Blame is absolutely an alienator. Certainly the team felt blamed. They were being blamed for products being late. I'd seen at Symbian that the answer to getting on-time product delivery was not to beat engineers up. It was to give them space. It's the exact opposite. So I could see those mistakes being made at Linn, management being angry, blaming engineers for late delivery, for poor quality. I arrived into that and was considered to be sort of part of that management group, whereas what I was trying to do was something completely different. But I'll tell you, within 9 months, 20 people of that 50 had left. It was pretty shocking and not what I'd expected. And I kept asking the question, is it me? Am I doing something wrong here? Do I have the right vision for this thing? I had to sort of at least have some confidence that my motives were good.
Where did that belief come from then, Gilad? The belief must have arrived at some stage for you to start making steps and moving things forward. Was there a single event or a piece of recognition that triggered that belief for you?
I think you go back to just the experience I'd had at Symbian, which was, as an engineering experience, was really positive. And I think at Linn, there was a really obvious problem, which was the design style had been kind of, you make the mechanical parts of the product, so the casework, and then you layer in the electronics, and then you would layer on the software. And so I could see that was kind of making the same mistake that Symbian was making in the early days, where you sort of, everybody does their bit and then you hope it all comes together. And I think I just knew that I would work out how to solve that problem. I didn't know how to solve it, but it looked familiar enough to what I'd seen in the early days of Symbian that we did solve. So I thought, yeah, I know the playbook here. I'll be able to work this out.
Interesting, just going back to your sort of learnings from that manager that you talked about very positively around this whole thing of sort of setting roles, but keeping your hands off, allowing people to do their jobs. I mean, when you were going through that crisis period, were you able to do that? Or did you need to sort of roll up your sleeves and get stuck in right in the middle for a period of time?
Yeah, I think you're pointing at something that is right, that if it's a crisis, you don't have the luxury of doing that because the setup wasn't right. So you couldn't just leave something that wasn't working just to keep on running. Something needed to change fundamentally in the structure and the process. In fact, it needed to start with the management, because management were creating product roadmaps and product deadlines by committee, and then they were being handed down to the engineers. So as soon as you do that, you're guaranteed unhappy engineers. I would say the management didn't understand enough about the technology at Linn. They didn't understand enough about, how to build like a realistic new product introduction plans. It was wishful thinking. And actually, the worse it got, because as things got later, then the demands from management to have more products and demanding more deadlines just increased. So first thing was get the situation under control, get it to something where I was able to see what was going on. Then I thought, get a group of leaders who I could work with. But then we come to the turning point, which is when 3 of those leaders resigned en masse together, dramatically throwing down their resignation letters together on my desk one Tuesday morning with smiles on their faces. And they had been planning to leave all along and had actually been working on their own projects.
Oh.
And they were going off to start their own competitor audio company, apparently. So I suppose there was a realization that, it was a bad thing and it was another thing, but it was more rot that was being removed, if you see what I mean. So there was a recognition eventually that, there was probably something good that was going to come, or that it had to happen. If that's what they'd been planning, it was going to happen anyway.
Gilad, was that how it felt? That kind of, that phrase, pain is the pivot. When it hurts enough, we'll change, that kind of thing. Was that the kind of the tipping point in terms of okay, now things are going to change? Or was it more gradual than that?
I think it probably was a tipping point. Yeah. I went to these three guys had a leaving drinks. I mean, there was leaving drinks practically every week, as you can imagine at that time. And I really didn't want to go to these leaving drinks, but I thought, I've got to show face. I've got to turn up at these leaving drinks. So I did. At Wetherspoons in the city centre, and I felt really lonely, and it was tough just to be there. And then there was this engineer who was there, who coincidentally had worked at Symbian back in the day, even at Scion, and I'd recruited him at Linn, and he said to me, you do realise everything is a complete mess. And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I said to him, well, I was thinking, I wonder if the integration processes that we put in place across all the software teams at Symbian would work if we put them across the mixed teams of mechanical, electrical and software engineers at Linn. And he said to me, you can. And that was like, for me, yes, right, okay, let's get to work. And so I had an ally, and we set about forming a team that would work the way we wanted. It started small, but we made it work the right way. We made the mechanical, electrical, electronic, software parts all work together from the beginning. We integrated every month, regularly, everything, that we had a trial product that didn't look like a real product, but it functioned partially all the time and got more functional as the project went on. And we proved out those integration techniques. Thanks to that, we built an entire operating system and platform for a new range of music streaming players from Linn that persists to this day, and that follow the same principles as my dad's turntable, software upgradable. If you got one in 2007, which is when we launched, you'd have it fully upgraded and working with Spotify and whatever else in 2025. So we adopted all the same principles as the turntable into a modern music streaming product, and that became a whole range and got Linn first mover advantage and got us to where we are today, as sort of number one with music streaming products in the world.
It's funny, isn't it, those kind of little interactions, that conversation in the pub, the one guy kind of saying, you can. Yeah. That kind of bit of external belief is sometimes enough. The rest is it's kind of building inside, but it's not arrived yet. And then one person just gives that little nudge.
That's right.
Okay, now I believe it. We get a chance to collaborate on that belief. We can bounce it back and forward between the two of us, and it starts building. It's not a light switch on or off, but it's the world starts getting brighter. It's starting to kind of spread through that business.
Exactly that, Pete. It was a profound moment for me. Like, it was almost like, right, let's get to work. Where do we start? Straight after that. And once we'd started this new team and started to embed the new processes, everything was then moving in a good direction in the R&D team from that point onwards. Another observation would be that when people are unhappy, they complain about all kinds of things. One of them would be, say, lack of communication would be a typical complaint I would hear. So you think, well, okay, I'll communicate more, and then people will stop complaining about lack of communication. But actually, that isn't the core issue. The core issue is much wider than that and much deeper than that. It's more about process. It's more about how we're working. It's more about whether people feel like they're winning when they come to work. So you can't take people's complaints at face value necessarily. What you can do is, when you hear people complaining a lot, you need to think, right, what's really going on here under the surface? There's a problem, people are unhappy, and it's longer to get to the root cause of it because people don't always know why they're unhappy.
Hi there, hope you're enjoying the episode. We know people power performance. When you unlock their potential, everything changes. That's why we built Mindflick, a SaaS solution where performance psychology meets innovative technology. Trusted by the best in sport and business, Mindflick transforms self-awareness into high-impact performance. We give you the tools to move from insight to action, creating results you can measure. If you're ready to elevate your leaders, empower your teams, and fuel your organization's growth, find out more at mindflick.co.uk and start your journey today. Now, back to the episode.
I want to ask one more question just before we go on to your third one, just around, we've been up to the Linn factory, right? And we've seen, just what an incredibly sort of well-oiled machine it is. That combination of automation, people, things running very smoothly, that there's obviously got to have very strong processes involved in that, but it's also people understanding their role and how it all flows together. And I suppose it just doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of work that needs to go into creating that environment.
I think actually underpinning everything, there has to be solid process. Like, there's got to be real meat to what you do. You have to understand your area. You have to ask the question, like, how's the system supposed to work? What's a well-oiled machine? What does it look like? What's our repeatable rule set that actually governs how this system is supposed to work? Well, that's the beginnings of being able to communicate it, being able to organize teams properly. And for us, processes are owned within teams. So we don't have a separate quality team at Linn. The teams are responsible for their own quality, which means they are responsible for their own processes. That is how we get this kind of ground up approach. I like to think of it as an upside down company where the teams are doing the work. They're the ones that are either designing products, making products, or selling products. They're closest to the customer. They know the most through their interactions with their processes, how well the process is working. So you have to create that culture of process ownership and process improvement. And people have to realize that they are responsible for those processes. Where it goes wrong is where you have a manager come in and they want to take responsibility for the process, tell people how to work, disempower people. So it's a particular way of working, which is a grassroots approach to running a business that relies on very self-starting and empowered people to want to work in these teams. And there's no manager in the team. It's a playing captain. So that's a different style as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is generally fascinating and sort of chimes so closely to the sort of world we're living in sport, where you have these sort of highly professionalized backroom staff and, big name coaches. And the temptation is for the coaches to sort of tell the players what to do and them just to nod their heads obediently. But we know that teams only function well in high-level sport when they can make decisions themselves under pressure on the pitch. And it is that same sort of culture and environment where you're sort of giving people ownership and responsibility, but not just expecting them to just do as they're told, and I think that's it's a really, really valuable lesson to learn there.
Can I ask one follow-up question just on that? Just that moment when, 3 people put their kind of resignation letters on the table, like, that's a hard thing for anyone to face. If, the version of you today, looking back to that version of you on that day, like, what would be your advice to that person? Because you ended up borrowing that belief from someone else in the discussion in the bar and then building on that from there. But at that moment, what would you have needed to hear?
Well, I would have liked to have heard, do you believe in what you're doing? And if the answer is yes, stick at it. Don't let this derail your plans. If that old saying, from Winston Churchill, if you're going through hell, keep going. That's what I needed to hear. What I actually heard from my manager when I joined Linn at the time was, what the hell are you doing to them down there?
Yeah.
Which just seems preposterous, doesn't it? But that's what he said to me. I don't know, it wasn't I don't think it was anything I did. It actually wasn't anything I did.
To sum up that section, that turning point really was almost reaching the lowest ebb, which was those 3 people sort of chucking their resignation on the desk, but actually the sort of redemption in the fact that someone validated your thinking and effectively gave you that level of support you needed to push forward, right? So it was sort of, it was like the closure of one phase and into the start of a new one.
Right. When we're going on now to talk about culture, the cultural problem at the time was this top-down management creeping into the business and the resulting unhappiness of the engineers, and not just the engineers, but that's what I saw, but it was right across the business. So that's also sort of realizing the culture of Linn that my dad had built over all these years had somehow been corrupted. And so that is an important lesson that then, goes into the next stage in my journey at Linn.
Okay, well, let's go on to turning point 3 then.
As I said, things weren't working at the business. And so one of the things that I instigated was to bring in some consultants that I'd worked with at Symbian. So I thought, well, I'll bring them into Linn. This had been 2006, and they'll help run a culture change program at Linn. And as part of that, we wanted to embed process, we wanted to embed accountability. And it started with the management team. That first phase was to come up with a set of a vision and a set of values that could be communicated, and process improvement sessions would be run. To cut a long story short, business performance got even worse through that time. So it seemed like the more accountability we sought and the more management we brought in to try and make this thing work better, the worse the situation became.
Slightly counterintuitive and probably doesn't say much for the consultancy industry or the management consultancy industry, but why wasn't it working? What did you learn from that? And what were the changes that needed to happen?
I think the consultants did a great job, but my reflection is that going out and telling people what your values are is not a substitute for a culture change. It's not a substitute for process improvement or really looking at how an organization ought to work, how to get things, the machine working properly, get that responsibility pushed down into the teams. We weren't doing any of that at that time. So it was probably a much bigger challenge than I thought. And ultimately, we got into trouble, and the bank came in one day, told us, that's it, we're pulling the plug on your lending. We were in debt with about £10 million. And there was sort of one meeting with the bank where it became apparent that significant redundancies were going to have to be made to cut costs in the business. That after that meeting, the non-family CEO of Linn at the time, he walked out that day and he never came back. I remember coming back into the company, and everyone was in shock. One of my team said to me, what about the culture change? And I said, this is the culture change. We don't have any choice anymore. Like we're going to have to go through a massive change here. And actually what happened as a result of that, which is that we refocused the business. We pulled out of all those other related and diversified businesses that we'd gone into and got back to our grassroots, our core as a hi-fi business selling hi-fi products to people in their homes, that we started to turn things around.
It's such a shift, isn't it, sometimes? I think that temptation, as you said there, you're kind of looking for you're looking for visible kind of results, and it's tempting to kind of think, well, if we look at values, if we look at this, if we get these words on the wall, that's going to be a force for shifting kind of these behaviors. We sort of jump on those things. And then it almost kind of comes back a little bit to what you said, I guess, right at the start, where you spoke about your father's kind of focus on getting the most out of the grooves itself. That simple focus, sometimes it forces us to simplify these moments of crisis and kind of go, what is the one thing we're definitely going to do here? And what are all the many things that we're not going to do?
Yeah. If you looked at Linn from the outside in 2006, you might have thought we were doing well. You'd have seen £35 million turnover, 346 people, massive growth from just a few years earlier. And if you look today, and we're a £22 million company with 170 people, but we're profitable and we generate cash and we're focused on the stuff that we love doing. So I learned a lot from that chasing big revenue growth can be utterly counterproductive. Adding staff like crazy can dilute the whole culture and ethos of an organization. The things that I never would want to go back to. It's so easy to drift from a culture, no matter what you say it is, if the processes aren't there and the people aren't right and bought into them and working the right way. When the culture is challenged, there's inevitably going to be something that happens. It's whether you tolerate it or not. And if you tolerate something that's out with that, it doesn't matter what you've said. You can undermine the whole thing just by tolerating one bit of bad behavior. For the sake of argument, say you had a senior leader who just shouts someone down for no good reason. Well, is that acceptable or not acceptable? You have to make that call, and you can't say it's your culture and then go, well, it was a senior member of my team And too bad. You have to live it and you have to take some really tough decisions because everybody's watching, right? Especially in those moments. And if you don't act, then you're just going to people say, same old company, nothing's changed around here. And that's it. The whole thing's fallen down like a house of cards.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with that. And when you know a culture is working well is when it becomes sort of self-policing. It's not just relying on you to do it. Everyone else is doing it as well. And that's when you know it's sort of deeply enough embedded for it to be sustainable. I've had plenty of instances in cricket and other environments where you talk about a culture and you talk about a way of operating. This is the way we do things around here. And if you aren't willing to police it, if you aren't willing to stand up for it, then it is nothing. And that's exactly what you've said there.
And the other part of the culture piece is not every part of an organization the size of Linn is at exactly the same place with culture all the time. It really depends. And you can neglect a part of a business. And so my observation would be that over time, there've been sort of many revolutions required in different parts of the business. We've gone, hang on a minute, we've drifted a bit here. You have to keep pruning. You have to keep looking at your organization and asking the question and understanding how people are. And because things change all the time. So have some people been left behind by a change? It's a constant process. And so I wouldn't say that we're ever done with culture at Linn. That would be what would lead to the next crisis, probably, if we ever thought like that again. You have to really value and take care of an organization's culture.
I really like that phrase, the pruning of the culture. And I remember when we did a piece of work around identity at one of the clubs that I worked at, I stumbled on a book by a guy called Joey Ryman, and he had a phrase, the fruits are in the roots. You've got to look at the roots of an organization, where it came from, what its history is, who is it, why was it created. That's the culture that underpins that organization. It sounds you're very similar to that initial setup of the business by your father as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do say that everything you need to know about Linn is in that first product, in that Sondek LP12. And if you take those principles and apply them to any product we make or anywhere, any team in the business, and his idea of one person building a product from start to finish at Linn, you can't go far wrong.
Gilad, it's been really fascinating listening to your story. It is worth just mentioning to our listeners that we have been up to your factory. We've been in your soundproof room, and being in there is an incredibly emotionally moving experience. I mean, to hear music, the quality that comes out of those speakers and out of those systems, it is genuinely mind-blowing, and it should be, because it's not cheap, let's be honest, Gilad, but it is extraordinary, and you can tell that there's so much passion and pride that goes into producing the products that you do. So massive congratulations from us.
Oh, thanks. I have to say it was a very, very emotional moment. I think, Pete, it was you, and you chose that song. Was it the Italian? But who was it again?
Andrea
the
Bocelli.
Father and son.
Yeah.
But Andrea Bocelli and his son. And I thought the whole room was about to burst into tears. It was
Gilad, it was a misjudgment. It was a misjudgment. I can only apologise.
I thought it was a great choice. I have since taken that track and used it on the road, and it's a great track. I absolutely love it. Fall on Me. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. Gilad, just to finish off, just the final question, and maybe you just touched on it in your sort of summary there, but if you had one thing that you'd like listeners to this podcast to take away from your experiences, what would it be?
I think when it comes to creative people, give them space. Like, let them be the ones to put their own timelines together. Give them that responsibility. Get that grassroots engagement from creative people. It keeps them happy, engaged. And speaking as somebody who started their career that way as an engineer, it's how I want it to be managed, and it's how I think you get the best out of creative people. Keep them happy, and it feeds right up through the organization.
Very wise words. Gilad, thank you so much for joining us on the Mindflick Podcast.
Thank you for having me.